Have you ever stood in the middle of everything you once knew, only to realize you had no idea who you could trust? Welcome to AGS Stories, where the truth always finds its way to the surface. If you love stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. The weight of my father's funeral ring pressed heavy against my finger as I watched the last of the mourners drift out of the mansion's grand foyer. The scent of white lilies and aged whiskey still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of a man who once filled this home with laughter, now reduced to a framed portrait surrounded by half-melted candles. My name is Emma Carter, and at 32, I never imagined standing in this house, my house, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The mansion had always been warm, filled with the sound of my father's deep chuckles echoing off the marble floors. But now it felt cold, empty, and wrong. Darling, you should really freshen up. Your mascara is running. Her voice sliced through my thoughts like a knife wrapped in silk. Victoria Bryant, my stepmother, stood near the grand staircase, flawless as always. Not a single golden hair out of place. Her designer black dress clinging to her frame as if grief itself had been custom-tailored for her. She looked every bit the grieving widow, but I knew better. I turned away, gripping my father's ring like a lifeline. I won't let her see me break. I'm fine, I muttered, stepping past her. A chill ran down my spine as I felt her eyes follow me, her diamond-studded fingers tightening around the crystal glass of whiskey she held. "As you wish," she hummed, placing a delicate hand on my shoulder. The sickly sweet scent of her expensive perfume invaded my senses. "We need to discuss the estate arrangements tomorrow. There are financial matters that require immediate attention." I bit the inside of my cheek. She couldn't even wait a full day before talking about money. Before I could respond, James, our butler for nearly 20 years, appeared beside me. "Miss Carter," his voice was calm but firm. "Might I have a word in private?" Victoria's fingers dug slightly into my shoulder before she let go, offering a too-perfect smile. "Of course," she said smoothly, stepping back. "I'll be in the study if anyone needs me." I didn't miss the way her heels clicked against the marble with purpose as she walked away. James led me toward the kitchen, his presence both familiar and unsettling. He had been with my father long before Victoria arrived. Loyal, quiet, always watching. Only when we were alone did he reach into his jacket pocket and pull out a sealed envelope, the paper slightly yellowed with age. "Your father asked me to give you this," he said carefully. "Only after the funeral." My breath hitched. "When did he give this to you?" James hesitated. 3 months ago, just before his diagnosis. He was very specific about the timing. My fingers trembled as I took the envelope, my father's familiar handwriting staring back at me. "For Emma, read this alone." A pit formed in my stomach as I unfolded the letter, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, I failed to tell you the truth in person, and for that I'm sorry. The mansion, our home, belongs to you. It always has." My chest tightened. "Through a trust your mother established before she passed. You are the sole owner of this estate. Victoria doesn't know. The official reading tomorrow will reveal everything, but I needed you to know first." I swallowed hard, gripping the letter as my father's final words sunk in. "Be careful, sweetheart. Watch the shadows." "Love, Dad." A sharp laugh escaped me, hollow and bitter. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was at war. My hands trembled as I reread my father's letter, the words searing into my mind like a brand. "The mansion, our home, belongs to you. It always has." A rush of emotions surged through me. Grief, disbelief, rage. My fingers curled tightly around the paper, as if holding onto it would somehow bring my father back, would somehow undo the reality that I had been living in a house where betrayal festered beneath the walls. My stepmother, Victoria Bryant, had lied to me. She had lied to everyone, and I had been too lost in my grief to see it. I looked up at James, my father's ever-loyal butler. His face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a knowing, a quiet understanding that spoke volumes. "Did you know about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James exhaled, his hands clasped in front of him. I know many things, Miss Carter, including the fact that Mrs. Bryant has been making frequent calls to real estate agents this past week. My heart stopped. She's trying to sell the house. James gave me a single nod. It appears so. I gritted my teeth, my entire body tightening with fury. This house wasn't hers to sell. It had never been hers. It belonged to me. My mother had secured that before she passed, and my father had made sure of it. And yet, Victoria had acted as though she owned everything. The wealth, the house, the legacy. She had always been cunning, always knew how to play the devoted wife in public, the grieving widow behind closed doors. But underneath that flawless exterior, there was something rotten. And now, I had proof. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my dress pocket. My hands no longer shook. Instead, they steadied as a new resolve took root inside me. James, where's Victoria right now? In the study, he answered without hesitation. I nodded. Good. As I approached the study, the heavy mahogany doors were slightly ajar. The soft hum of Victoria's voice filtered through, silky and composed. Yes, I understand that, but I need this process expedited, she said, irritation creeping into her tone. I don't care what the formal reading says tomorrow. Edward was reckless in his final months, and I have to ensure financial stability before this house falls into complete disrepair. I stiffened. A second voice responded, male, professional, a real estate agent, Mrs. Bryant. Without the official documents, I can't proceed with any listings. But once the estate is legally transferred, we can discuss potential buyers. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Victoria let out a forced laugh. You don't understand. It will be transferred to me. I just need to handle a few things first. The agent hesitated. Handle? Just be ready to move forward when I call, she snapped before hanging up. For a moment, silence settled in the room. Then I heard the unmistakable clink of ice against glass. She was celebrating, like she had already won, like she had already erased me, like my father's death was nothing more than an inconvenience she had to maneuver around. Something inside me snapped. I pushed the doors open, stepping inside. Victoria didn't even flinch. She lifted her glass of scotch to her lips, watching me with the slow, assessing gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. Emma, darling, she purred, setting the glass down. You look positively pale. Are you feeling unwell? I took a slow step forward, my heart hammering. Funny, I said, voice even. I was about to ask you the same thing. She arched a perfectly sculpted brow. Is there something you'd like to discuss? I leveled my gaze at her. I heard your call. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even amusement, passed through her eyes. Eavesdropping now? She mused, standing gracefully. That's hardly appropriate behavior, dear. Then again, you never did learn proper etiquette. My fingers curled into fists. How long have you been planning this, Victoria? She sighed, tilting her head slightly. Planning what? Exactly? Selling the house, I snapped. Stealing everything my father built. Lying to me? For a moment, she merely studied me. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached for her glass again. Emma, you're grieving, she said smoothly. I understand that. I truly do. But you must see reason. Your father made mistakes. He was not in the right state of mind near the end. The estate is in turmoil. I am simply doing what is necessary to preserve it. Preserve it? I let out a hollow laugh. By secretly calling real estate agents? By trying to sell my home before the will is even read? Victoria's expression darkened slightly. Emma, she said, voice laced with warning. This is not your house. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. Actually, Victoria, I murmured, letting the words sink in. It is. Her lips parted slightly, the first crack in her mask. I pulled the folded letter from my pocket and held it up. Dad knew what you were planning. My voice didn't waver, and he made sure you'd never get away with it. For a split second, something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Shock, fury, panic. But then, just as quickly, she smoothed it away, offering a breathy laugh. "Oh, sweetheart," she crooned, stepping closer. "He always did love to dote on you, but you mustn't let yourself get carried away with. Save it." I tossed the letter onto the desk, watching as her gaze darted toward it. "The mansion is mine. It always has been, and tomorrow, when the will is read, everyone will know it." Victoria's hand twitched slightly. Then her mask slipped completely. The fake sympathy drained from her face, replaced by something colder. "Sharper, you think you're so clever," she murmured, her voice smooth as glass but laced with venom. "You think you've won?" I didn't flinch. "I don't think," I whispered. "I know." I stormed out of the study, my pulse pounding. I needed proof. My father wouldn't have left me defenseless. He knew Victoria. He knew what she was capable of. And if he left that letter, there had to be more. My fingers curled around my phone, and I dialed. "Liv?" My voice was breathless. "Emma? What's wrong? I need you here. Now." 30 minutes later, Olivia stood beside me in my father's office. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked. I exhaled. "A safe. I know it's here. My father mentioned it once. When I was a kid, he told me, your birthday, your mom's birthday, and the day we met." My fingers hovered over the massive landscape, painting hanging behind the desk. "Help me move this." Together, we lifted the painting, revealing a steel safe embedded in the wall. Olivia let out a low whistle. "Damn, your dad didn't mess around." I pressed my fingers against the cool metal, inhaling deeply before spinning the combination. Click! The door swung open. Inside, stacks of folders and thick envelopes filled the space. But one thing stood out, a small, black USB drive labeled insurance. I reached for it, my heart thundering. "Emma," Olivia breathed, pointing at a stack of papers. "Look at this." I pulled them out. Financial records, fraudulent transactions, evidence of meetings between Victoria and our lawyer. And at the bottom of the pile, photos. Photos of Victoria meeting privately with several different men. Some I recognized, businessmen, investors. Others, complete strangers. My breath caught in my throat. "Oh my God!" Olivia's voice was a whisper. "Emma, your dad knew? He knew everything. What do you think I should do next?" Comment 111 if you think I should expose her immediately. Comment 222 if you think I should wait for the will reading to drop the bombshell. I stood in the dimly lit study, gripping the USB drive in one hand and the stack of documents in the other. My heart pounded, but not with fear. With clarity, with certainty. Victoria had spent years manipulating, deceiving, and gaslighting her way through this family. She had woven a web of lies so intricate that, for a time, even I had been caught in it. But now I was about to tear it all apart. I turned to Olivia, my best friend, my anchor. She had been flipping through the photos, her eyes narrowing with every new piece of evidence. "This," she muttered, shaking her head, "this is enough to destroy her." I exhaled slowly. She won't go down without a fight. Olivia looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded. "Then make sure she knows she's already lost." I didn't need to be told twice. I found Victoria exactly where I expected, in the grand sitting room, sipping her usual evening scotch, the picture of elegance and composure. She barely glanced up when I entered. "Emma," she greeted smoothly, as if we weren't locked in a battle for control over this house, over my father's legacy. "You're up late." I stepped forward, holding the files up. "You were planning to sell my house, weren't you?" Victoria's eyes flickered just for a second, but I caught it. She sighed, setting down her glass with a practiced grace. "Darling, what are you talking about?" I let the files drop onto the coffee table between us, the papers fanning out, bank statements, forged documents, photographs of her secret meetings. "Do not play dumb with me, Victoria." My voice was steady, unwavering. "I know everything." She leaned back, crossing her legs. She wasn't fazed. "Not yet." "Emma, you're upset. I understand. Losing a parent is—" I cut her off. "Spare me the sympathy act. I heard your phone call. You've been working with real estate agents. You were trying to sell this house before the will was even read." A slow, amused smile spread across her face. "Eavesdropping now? How very undignified." I clench my jaw. Stop pretending you don't know exactly what you've done. She sighed dramatically and picked up one of the documents. Oh, Emma, she murmured, skimming the words. Is this supposed to scare me? Those are legal records, Victoria, I said coldly. Fraudulent transfers, unauthorized withdrawals in Dad's name. You were embezzling from him while he was dying. Her smile didn't waver. Your father was a brilliant man, she said smoothly, setting the paper down. But near the end, he was making reckless financial decisions. Someone had to step in. I scoffed. By stealing from him? By faking his signature. Victoria's lips parted slightly, the first real crack in her composure. I pressed forward. I have the original bank statements, the legitimate ones. I compared the signatures. They don't match. She stood then, walking to the window, staring out as if I had merely interrupted her evening, not exposed her for the fraud she was. You have no idea what it takes to run this estate, she murmured. The debts, the maintenance costs. Lies. She turned sharply at that. I stepped closer. The estate is completely solvent. Dad left it in perfect financial standing. I tilted my head. So tell me, Victoria, where did all that money go? She didn't answer. Instead, she moved toward the liquor cabinet, pouring herself another drink. Emma, sweetheart, she sighed, swirling the amber liquid. You're in over your head. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, but all you've really done is proven how little you understand about real power. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Oh, I understand plenty. I reached for the final piece of evidence, the USB drive labeled insurance. I held it up between two fingers, watching as her gaze flickered to it. Her grip on the glass tightened. This, I said softly, is everything. Victoria's face remained composed, but I saw it. The tension in her shoulders, the slight shift in her posture. She placed her glass down carefully. You're bluffing? I inserted the drive into my laptop, turning the screen toward her. Files filled the display. Emails, surveillance footage, copies of wire transfers, and then the photographs. Photographs of Victoria, sitting in cafes and private lounges with multiple men. Some were business executives. Others, lawyers, investors, bankers. The timestamps went back years. Her face paled. I tilted my head. You had contingency plans, didn't you? Multiple men lined up, ready to help you liquidate assets and disappear. I scrolled through the images. Jameson Carter, CEO of Westwood Holdings. Daniel Royce, private investor. And, of course, our very own family lawyer, William Ashford. Victoria's fingers twitched at that last name. Do you really think he'll protect you? I mused. Do you think any of them will? Once they realize I have all of this? She inhaled sharply through her nose, finally looking at me with something dangerously close to fear. I leaned in. How does it feel, Victoria? I asked softly, knowing that, for once, you don't control the narratives. For the first time, she said nothing. She reached for her drink again, but her hands weren't as steady as before. Then she laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Clever, she murmured, swirling her glass. You really are your father's daughter. She turned to face me fully. But don't get comfortable, Emma. This isn't over. I crossed my arms. Oh, but it is. Tomorrow, when the will is read, you'll be nothing but a bad memory in this house. She smirked. You think a piece of paper will decide that? I met her gaze head on. It already has. Her smirk faltered for half a second before she quickly masked it. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You don't understand the kind of people I know, she murmured. You think you've won because you have a few papers and a USB drive? That's cute. I didn't flinch. Instead, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. And you don't understand the kind of person I've become, I said quietly. I don't scare easily. Victoria held my gaze for a long moment. Then she smiled. Slow, sinister, calculated. Well then, she whispered, I suppose we'll see, won't we? I exhaled, steadying myself. She thought she still had power. She thought she still had control. But tomorrow, at the will reading, she would learn exactly how wrong she was. If you were in my position, what would you do next? If you agree with my approach, comment 111. If you have another strategy, let me know in the comments. The next morning, the air inside the mansion was thick with tension. The grand parlor, usually reserved for lavish parties and elegant gatherings, had been transformed into a battleground. I stood near the fireplace, my father's ring cold against my skin. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. The lawyer, Mr. Calloway, sat at the large oak table, the official will and testament of Edward Carter resting in front of him. Victoria sat across from me, perfectly poised, perfectly confident. She had no idea what was coming. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Calloway asked, adjusting his glasses. Victoria flashed her usual rehearsed, sympathetic smile and nodded. "Yes, of course," she purred. "Let's get this over with." I remained silent, my fingers tightening around the armrest of my chair. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat and opened the folder. Edward Carter's last will and testament was updated 6 months ago, shortly before his passing. As per his final requests, the reading will begin with a message directly from Mr. Carter himself. Victoria's smile wavered slightly. "What?" she asked, her voice still composed but with an edge of unease. Mr. Calloway gestured to his assistant, who rolled a television screen into the room and pressed play. The room went silent as my father's face appeared on the screen, his familiar deep voice filling the space. "If you're watching this, I'm no longer here." A hush fell over the room. "Victoria, I trusted you. I believed in you. But you betrayed this family." I turned to look at Victoria, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw real fear in her eyes. She shot out of her seat. "This is absurd," she snapped, glaring at Mr. Calloway. Edward was clearly unwell before he passed. His judgment was impaired. The video continued, drowning out her protests. "I knew what you were doing behind my back. The secret meetings, the stolen money, the fake signatures. You thought I wouldn't notice? I noticed everything." Victoria's face drained of color. My father smiled sadly on screen. "I didn't stop you at first because I needed proof. And now I have it. I've made sure everything is in place to expose you. The evidence is with my lawyers. And by the time this video plays, the authorities will already have it." As if on cue, the parlor doors burst open. 2 FBI agents stepped inside. "Victoria Bryant, we need you to come with us." For a second, Victoria was frozen. Then she lunged for me. "You ungrateful little." Security was on her before she could touch me, restraining her arms as she screamed. "This is a setup," she shrieked, twisting in their grip. "You think you're clever? You think this is over? I'll fight this. I'll take everything from you." I stood slowly, smoothing my dress. "You already took everything, Victoria," I said calmly, steadily. "And now you're left with nothing." One of the FBI agents stepped forward, reading from an official document. "Victoria Bryant, you are under investigation for fraud, identity theft, and financial embezzlement. We have substantial evidence of offshore accounts, falsified documents, and illegal transfers made under Edward Carter's name." Victoria shook her head frantically. I didn't do anything wrong," the agent continued. "Additionally, multiple recorded conversations and witness statements confirmed that you conspired with external parties to liquidate assets before the estate was legally transferred." I folded my arms. "That means you tried to steal my inheritance before my father's body was even cold." Victoria's breath hitched. The room had turned against her. She turned to her lawyer, Dan Parker. "Dan," she gasped, "tell them this is nonsense. Tell them we had everything handled." Dan didn't move. Instead, he stood adjusting his tie. "Mrs. Bryant," he began slowly, "I regret to inform you that I will no longer be representing you." Victoria stared at him in shock. "You coward," she spat. "After everything I did for you?" Dan simply turned to Mr. Calloway. "For the record," he said smoothly, "I have agreed to fully cooperate with authorities and provide all necessary documents regarding Mrs. Bryant's financial dealings." Victoria's expression crumbled. She looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one did. Mr. Calloway closed the will folder. "As per Edward Carter's final wishes," he said firmly, "Victoria Bryant is entitled to nothing. She has no legal claim to this estate, and she is hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately." Silence. Then Victoria let out a choked laugh. "You can't do this," she whispered, shaking her head. You don't understand the kind of people I know, Emma. You don't understand the kind of power I have. I walked over to her slowly, looking her straight in the eyes. I understand perfectly, I said, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. Victoria stared at me, breathing heavily. Then she let out a guttural scream. This isn't over, she shrieked as the FBI agents dragged her toward the door. She struggled, thrashing wildly. I will ruin you. I will come back for everything. You will regret this, Emma. You will. The doors slammed shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. A long, heavy silence settled over the room. Then Olivia let out a slow whistle. Well, she murmured. That was satisfying. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. My hands were still shaking, my pulse still racing. Mr. Calloway turned to me. Miss Carter, he said, there are some final papers that require your signature. I nodded. Of course. As I signed my name, the weight of the moment finally settled in. I had won. The mansion was mine. My father's legacy was safe. Victoria was gone. But more than that, I had proven that I was stronger than she ever gave me credit for. I turned back to Olivia. Do you think she'll try to come back? I asked. Olivia smirked. Probably. But next time, she won't even make it through the front gate. I smiled, because she was right. This was my house, and no one would take it from me again. If you think you're luckier than me, comment 333. If you think your life has been even more tragic than mine, comment 555. Because at the end of the day, we all have our battles. But some of us, we win. 3 days. That was all the time Victoria needed to crawl out of the wreckage of her downfall and attempt to strike back. I had barely begun to breathe again, barely started to feel the weight of my victory when I received the call. Emma, you need to get to the courthouse. Now. It was Mr. Calloway, my lawyer, his voice unusually tense. Victoria just filed an emergency injunction. She's claiming your father was mentally incompetent when he changed the will. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my coat and stormed out the door. She wasn't done, but neither was I. By the time I arrived at the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation and the undeniable scent of impending war. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture still elegant, but her eyes betrayed her desperation. She had traded her designer dresses for a more subdued black suit, an attempt to appear the picture of solemn dignity. Her new lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Jonathan Reed, shuffled through stacks of documents, avoiding my gaze as I took my seat. Mr. Calloway leaned in. She's pulling every trick in the book. Claimed your father wasn't in his right mind when he updated the will. Said you manipulated him. Even hinted at medical records that support her claim. I clenched my jaw. There are no medical records. He was fully competent. Mr. Calloway nodded. We know that, but she's got a judge in her pocket. My stomach twisted. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Dan Parker, Victoria's former lawyer. Her co-conspirator. She stiffened at the sight of him, her nails digging into the wooden table. Dan strode in, expression unreadable, and took a seat directly behind the prosecution. And then, the judge entered. Judge Harrison. I felt my stomach drop. I recognized his name. He had handled Victoria's second divorce years ago. And if she had picked him for this hearing, it meant he owed her favors. I had expected Victoria to fight back, but I hadn't expected her to be this reckless. But that was the thing about desperate people. They made mistakes, and I was going to make sure this was the last one she ever made. Victoria's lawyer stood first. Your Honor, we are here today to correct a grave injustice. Edward Carter was a man of great influence and wealth, but in his final days, he was not in a state to make rational decisions. I gritted my teeth. The evidence will show, he continued, that his sudden decision to alter his will was not his own, but rather the result of manipulation by his daughter, Emma Carter, who sought to gain control of his estate before his passing. I exhaled sharply. Lies. Victoria sat still, hands folded in her lap, looking composed, refined, and oh so tragic. Then it was our turn. Mr. Calloway stood. Your Honor, what we are witnessing today is nothing more than a last-ditch effort to undermine Edward Carter's wishes and rewrite history to benefit a woman who has already been exposed as a fraud. He gestured toward me. Miss Carter has already been declared the rightful heir to her father's estate. Any claim that Edward Carter was mentally incompetent is not only baseless, but directly contradicts the medical records we have obtained from his personal physician. He handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Harrison. Furthermore, Mr. Calloway continued, we have new evidence proving that Mrs. Bryant has engaged in a pattern of financial fraud stretching back over a decade. Victoria's head snapped toward him. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and flipped through the documents. I watched as his expression shifted, his jaw tightening, his fingers tapping against the desk. He wasn't pleased, and I knew why, because he was in those documents too. For the first time, Victoria looked nervous. Then the prosecution stood again. Your Honor, Victoria's lawyer said hastily, these accusations are unfounded. There is no substantial proof linking Mrs. Bryant to any financial misconduct. That's when Dan Parker stood. Actually, there is. The entire room went silent. Victoria's breath hitched. Mr. Parker, Judge Harrison said slowly, you are not listed as a witness. I'd like to be added, Dan interrupted smoothly. He adjusted his tie, then turned toward Victoria. Mrs. Bryant, he said, we both know how this ends. So I'm going to make this easy for myself and tell the truth. Victoria shot up from her seat. Sit down, Dan. He didn't. Instead, he pulled a thick folder from his briefcase and handed it to the bailiff. In here, he said, you'll find financial statements, emails, and transaction records that prove Mrs. Bryant was siphoning funds from Edward Carter's accounts for years. You'll also find evidence of her offshore accounts, as well as records of private meetings with this very judge. Judge Harrison's face turned pale. Victoria whirled on him. You spineless bastard, she hissed. Dan shrugged. You were always going to throw me under the bus eventually, Victoria. I just beat you to it. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. But it was too late. It didn't take long after that. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria tried to object, tried to deny, tried to argue, but no one was listening anymore. 30 minutes later, the judge made his ruling. Mrs. Bryant's claims are entirely without merit. Furthermore, in light of new evidence presented today, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the financial dealings of both Mrs. Bryant and this court. Silence. Then chaos. 2 federal agents entered the room. One turned to Victoria. Mrs. Bryant, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted legal manipulation. Victoria went still. Then she laughed. She laughed. You think this is over, she whispered. The agent reached for her wrist, but she yanked her arm away. She turned to me, her eyes burning with rage. You have no idea what's coming. I met her gaze, steady and unshaken. Oh, I know exactly what's coming, I said coldly. Justice. Outside the courthouse. I felt the weight of it all sink in. Victoria was gone. Her empire? Crumbling. And I was still standing. That's when I heard a voice behind me. Well, that was quite the show. I turned. Lily, my half-sister, the daughter my father had before he met my mother, the one who had walked away from this family years ago. I swallowed. Lily, she gave me a small smirk. Looks like you handled things well. I hesitated. Why are you here? Her smirk faded. Because Victoria's not done yet, she said quietly. And if you want to stop what comes next, you're going to need me. I stiffened. What do you mean? Lily exhaled. Let's just say, she murmured, Victoria wasn't the only one playing this game. I stared at her, my pulse quickening. Because in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. And just like that, Victoria was gone. 15 years in a lovely federal prison, where she would have all the time in the world to reflect on her life choices, practice her courtroom dramatics, and if the rumors were true, learn how to make a mean prison casserole. Justice? Served. 3 weeks later, I stood in the grand foyer of the mansion. My mansion, watching as the last of Victoria's ridiculously expensive furniture was hauled away like the bad memories they carried. Her lifetime collection of designer heels? Donated. Her hand-carved Italian vanity? Sold. That hideous gold-trimmed portrait of herself she hung in the dining room burned. Okay, legally, I had it put in storage, but in my heart, it burned. I turned to Olivia, who was sipping a celebratory mimosa and watching the movers with the satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed karma at full speed. I have to admit, she said, taking another sip, seeing Victoria dragged out in cuffs was already the highlight of my year. But this is a close second. I smirked. The best part? This place is actually going to mean something now. The East Wing. The part of the mansion Victoria had only ever used for hoarding overpriced furniture was already being renovated into a women's shelter. A real home for women who needed it most. A way to finally honor my mother's legacy instead of letting it rot under Victoria's greed. Lily, my newly reclaimed half-sister, walked in, holding a folder of paperwork and a very necessary third mimosa. Well, she said, glancing around, the place looks less like a villain's lair and more like an actual home. I'd say that's progress. I raised an eyebrow. You're staying? She gave me a smirk that was way too similar to Dad's. I think I'll stick around, she said. After all, someone has to make sure you don't redecorate this place with terrible wallpaper. Olivia choked on her drink from laughter, and just like that, for the first time in a long, long time, the mansion felt alive again. If this whole experience has taught me anything, it's that stepmothers with a love for fraud and manipulation do not make good landlords. The FBI works shockingly fast when you give them enough evidence. Justice tastes even better than revenge, but revenge is still pretty damn delicious. So, what do you think? Did Victoria get what she deserved? Would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments. If you think karma worked its magic, comment 11. And if you would have gone even further, comment 222 because I respect that energy. And if you love real-life justice stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. Because trust me, this isn't the last time someone tries to play dirty and ends up losing everything. See you next time.